Brian's journey had always been marked by dedication and hard work. Growing up in a modest household, he learned the value of perseverance from his father, who worked tirelessly to provide for the family. Those lessons stayed with Brian as he built a life for himself, climbing the ranks in his career while remaining a devoted father and husband. Despite his efforts, life wasn't without its challenges. Over the years, Brian found himself juggling the demands of his job at Harding Containers with the responsibilities of raising a family. Balancing late-night shifts and weekend projects often left him exhausted, but he took pride in his ability to provide for his wife and son. He had always believed that hard work and loyalty were the keys to maintaining a happy home. Brian Welker's face lit up as he brushed away the beads of sweat from his forehead. Earlier that day, he received exciting news. He had been promoted to shift supervisor at Harding Containers, with the new role taking effect immediately. As if the promotion wasn't enough, he was assigned to the night shift, a schedule many avoided but one that suited Brian perfectly. For Brian, the timing couldn't have been better. His teenage son, a high school junior, was deeply involved in sports and extracurricular activities. By working nights, Brian would have the freedom to attend his son's events without compromising his job. He was no stranger to the challenges of a nocturnal schedule, having worked similar shifts in the past. Over the years, he had mastered the art of adapting his sleep routine to daytime hours, making the transition manageable. That explained why Brian found himself crawling through the trusses of his attic on a sweltering August afternoon. With Thursday and Friday off to prepare for his new responsibilities, he decided to use the time to ready himself for the job, which officially started Sunday night. Brian had been planning to transform the area above his detached garage into a cozy studio apartment. He envisioned it as a tranquil hideaway where he could rest during the day without disruptions. He was determined to avoid the typical disturbances that often come with trying to sleep while the rest of the world is bustling. One of his tasks involved running an internet cable to the new space. The Wi-Fi signal from the main house didn't reach the garage, so Brian decided to install a signal extender in the attic closest to the garage, hoping it would provide a strong connection in his future retreat. As he stretched out in the attic, carefully unwinding the cable, he heard faint noises coming from somewhere inside the house. The sounds puzzled him as the house should have been empty. His wife, Brenda, was working, and their son, Tim, was away visiting her parents for a few days. Intrigued, Brian began moving toward the source of the noise. After creeping about 15 feet closer, he pinpointed the origin. It was coming from the master bedroom. The muffled voices became clearer as he positioned himself above an unused air vent in the bedroom ceiling. Years ago, Brenda had complained that the vent blew cold air directly onto her, which she believed contributed to persistent neck pain. To resolve the issue, Brian had installed a new vent on the opposite side of the room. Rather than remove the old one and patch the ceiling, he had simply left it in place, disconnected from any ductwork. He carefully peeled back the layer of fiberglass insulation that covered the attic floor, exposing the old vent underneath. What he saw through the slats made his stomach churn. His wife of 2 decades entwined with a slender man whose pale, almost glowing skin stood out starkly in the dim light. The scene before him was like a slow-motion disaster, horrifying yet impossible to look away from. Brian found himself frozen, watching the wreckage of what had once been his marriage unfold. The two had been locked in their passionate encounter for several minutes before Brian's shock began to dissipate, and his mind kicked into gear. With steady hands, he pulled out his phone, switched to video mode, and carefully positioned it on the vent. The angle provided a clear, uninterrupted view of the bed where his trust had just been shattered. "Does your husband ever tap this prime kitty? Or does he have a needle Johnson?" the man teased smugly. "I've told you before not to bring up Brian," Brenda replied, though her tone lacked conviction in Brian's view. "This isn't about him. He's a good husband, a wonderful father, and a great partner in every way." "Oh, I'm sure he is," the man responded with a chuckle, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yet here we are in his bed, and you're insisting you're perfectly satisfied with what he offers. Don't you see how ridiculous that sounds?" Brian couldn't fathom why he'd let himself be persuaded into this. "Why here of all places?" "Ah, right there!" Brenda's groan pierced the room. "There's no risk in your apartment. I'm going to come." Her lover stiffened, his body rigid, before rolling off her with a satisfied sigh. For a moment, the room was silent. "You feel the rush now?" he teased, catching his breath. "Sure, my apartment works fine, but doing it in your own bed? That's next-level thrill." Brian recognized him immediately. Bill Grant, a divorced delivery driver from their shared workplace. His daughter even went to school with their son, Tim. Brenda sounded distant. "This is messed up," she said flatly. You get off on this, don't you? Like it's some twisted game. Sleeping with me in Brian's bed? Grant chuckled softly. It is a game, at least for men. The closeness is amazing, but knowing I'm doing it in your husband's bed? That makes me the winner. Her tone grew sharper. You'd feel less like a winner if Brian caught us. I can't believe I agreed to this. It's not happening again. I don't want to destroy my marriage. Grant smirked. Fine. Keep him out of the bedroom and I won't push for the bed. But if he gets back between your legs, I'll need to reclaim my spot. Brenda hesitated. I'm not cutting him off completely. He's my husband, but I'll discourage him as much as I can. I can't even imagine what he'd do if he found out. Brian had heard every word from the attic. He'd come home early, parking in the garage out of sight. Sweat poured off him as he lay motionless, listening to the pair dress and leave. His stomach churned, but he resisted the urge to vomit. Cleaning up wasn't an option, not here. Descending the ladder, Brian's thoughts churned. His wife was sleeping with another man in their home, in their bed. She was even planning to deny him intimacy to keep her affair going. The realization stung, but it also gave him clarity. In the shower, he reached a decision. Brenda didn't know he'd uncovered her betrayal, and he intended to keep it that way. With Tim still in high school for 2 more years, his son became Brian's sole priority. Brenda? She no longer mattered. Why should he care for someone who clearly held him in such disregard? Leaving wasn't an option. He'd invested years remodeling their house and wasn't about to hand it over to some creep. Brenda hadn't mentioned divorce, so he'd stick it out until Tim graduated. In the meantime, he needed his separate space, a sanctuary. His small apartment above the garage, once a place to nap between shifts, would now become his home. A full kitchen, a bathroom upgrade, whatever it took to make it livable. Brian made calls to contractors, determined to finish the space quickly and professionally. His promotion afforded him the luxury of outsourcing the work. For the first time, he realized his time was worth more than saving a few dollars. Every penny saved would only be split with Brenda in the end. The betrayal had shattered his old mindset. Brian resolved to focus on Tim's future and rebuild his own life. Brenda's affair had freed him from any lingering loyalty. By the time Brenda returned that evening, Brian had regained his composure. She paused in surprise upon seeing him at the kitchen table. You're home early. Did something happen? He glanced at her, noticing details he'd never observed before. The fine lines, the slight weight gain. Had love blinded him to these imperfections? It saddened him to feel so detached, but the choice to cheat had been hers. I got asked to switch to night shifts for a while, he replied evenly. They let me come home to rest before I head back in. That's awful. You'll burn out working a double, she fretted. At least try to nap for a bit. Brian nodded. Good idea. I'll just crawl into bed and... Wait! Brenda blurted out, panic flashing across her face. I just remembered. I need to wash the sheets. Brian's expression remained calm, though inside he relished her discomfort. No problem. I'll use the guest room. No need to worry yourself. As he walked away, Brenda stood frozen, her panic unspoken. Brian smirked grimly to himself. Let her squirm. He had plans of his own now, and she wasn't part of them. A few hours later, Brian left the house, pretending to head to work. Instead, he stopped at a sports bar, enjoyed a baseball game, and had a couple of beers. When he was sure Brenda was asleep, he returned home, parking in the garage and slipping upstairs to the air mattress he'd prepared in his unfinished apartment. He slept surprisingly well. The next morning, one of the contractors he'd contacted offered a discounted rate to start immediately due to an upcoming project. Brian agreed without hesitation, signing the contract for work to begin Monday. That evening, Brian opted to sleep in the guest room, citing his need to adjust to night shifts. Brenda appeared unsettled by his choice, but Brian brushed it off. Over the weekend, he spent time with Tim, did yard work, and continued sleeping in the guest room, further confusing Brenda. On Sunday night, Brian began his first shift as foreman. He hadn't mentioned the promotion to Brenda, feeling no obligation to share details with someone who had been keeping secrets from him. The transition to his new role went smoothly, and he was pleased with his team's competence. Monday morning brought the start of construction on his apartment. After briefly discussing the plans with the crew, Brian went to bed in the guest room, though construction noise and an ill-timed call from his mother-in-law interrupted his sleep. Annoyed, he unplugged the phone and eventually fell back asleep. By the end of the week, the renovations were complete. Brian was impressed with how quickly the contractors had transformed the space. It was a far cry from his previous do-it-yourself approach, which would have taken months. That afternoon, he ordered furniture, appliances, and a TV to fully outfit the apartment. By Monday, everything would be in place, and his newly finished apartment, his personal refuge, would be ready to occupy. For the first time, Brian felt like he was regaining control of his life. When Brenda arrived home Monday and saw a crew working on the garage, she was visibly puzzled. Brian was chatting with the foreman, but she insisted they step aside so he could explain. Brian revealed he was converting the space above the garage into an apartment, fully insulated to block noise and without a landline. It would serve as a quiet retreat while he adjusted to working night shifts. He assured her it wouldn't affect family time, as he still planned to attend Tim's baseball games and have dinner with them. Brenda, unsettled by the arrangement, questioned Brian's intentions, but he dismissed her concerns. Their conversation turned tense when Brian made sarcastic remarks about intimacy, brushing off her frustrations. Brenda lashed out, demanding an apology and a proper date if he wanted to reconcile. Brian responded with a smile and walked away, leaving her confused. His dismissive attitude worried Brenda. He had always been attentive, but now he seemed distant and indifferent. By Wednesday, Brian had fully moved into his new apartment, just in time for the long Labor Day weekend. At dinner Thursday, he suggested taking Tim to a Diamondbacks game against the Dodgers. Tim was thrilled, but Brenda declined, claiming she didn't enjoy baseball. Brian casually remarked that she'd find something else to do at home, a comment that didn't go unnoticed. Encouraged by Tim's excitement, Brian suggested inviting Tim's friend Scooter to join them. Tim eagerly called Scooter, who quickly got permission from his mom. Brenda used the opportunity to mention that Scooter, whose real name was Horace, had recently moved to the area with his widowed mother to be closer to her ailing parents. Brian was amused by the boy's nickname and decided to stick with it. On Saturday, Tim drove to Scooter's house to pick him up. Scooter ran out to the truck but mentioned his mom wanted to meet Brian first. Apologizing for the inconvenience, Scooter led Brian to the door. Brian, unfazed, rang the bell and prepared to make a good impression. The excitement for the game was palpable, setting the tone for a bonding experience Brian intended to enjoy fully with his son. When Brian knocked on Scooter's door, it was opened by a slender woman around his age, casually dressed in running shorts and a tank top. Her strong, shapely legs immediately caught his attention, though he tried to remain discreet. To his surprise, Scooter's mom caught him off guard with a cheeky comment about her legs being her best feature. Embarrassed but amused, Brian admitted they looked great. She playfully scolded him for being so obvious and teased that she was raising her son to be a gentleman, not someone who ogled women. Recognizing her humor, Brian leaned into the banter, joking about teaching Scooter to appreciate women properly while also learning how to judge subtly. Their lighthearted exchange continued until she introduced herself as Gertrude. Brian laughed at her formal name and insisted on calling her Minx, much to her amusement. As they chatted, she shared that she loved baseball and came from a family of fans. Her father had even played minor league ball. Pleased with their interaction, she gave Scooter permission to join Brian and Tim for the game, praising Tim as a polite young man. At the game, the three had a fantastic time. Scooter caught a foul ball, and both boys indulged in too many hot dogs and sodas. On the way home, they fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted but happy. When they reached Scooter's house, Brian helped the groggy boy to the door, where Gertrude greeted them with a smile. She thanked Brian for taking Scooter and laughed when Brian confessed they had overindulged on ballpark snacks. Before leaving, Brian called Scooter a great kid, sticking to his nickname for Gertrude, much to her amusement. Brian soon settled into a routine. His new apartment over the garage became his private sanctuary, and he slept soundly there, thanks to the noise-proofing and blackout curtains. Brenda occasionally complained about him staying in the man cave even on weekends, but she dropped the topic whenever Brian teasingly asked if she needed his services. He suspected her real concern was keeping her affair hidden and avoiding any confrontation. Her hesitation to press for divorce reassured Brian that his plan to remain married until Tim's graduation was still on track. With his new role as foreman leaving him less physically active, Brian invested in a home gym and committed to regular workouts, which proved effective. He stayed involved in Tim's life, attending all his baseball practices and games. Before long, the coach asked Brian to help train small groups of players. Tim showed steady improvement and became a reliable center fielder, but Scooter's transformation impressed Brian the most. Initially timid, Scooter blossomed under Brian's guidance, growing more confident and skilled. They spent weekends practicing together, which gave Brian a positive outlet for his energy. By mid-season, Scooter was batting cleanup and excelling at shortstop, while Tim held his spot as the team's third batter and center fielder. Brian was immensely proud of both boys and enjoyed his role in their success. He also noticed the growing attention from some of the other players' mothers. His humor seemed to resonate with them, and they often complimented his efforts with the kids. Occasionally, they brought baked goods for the team, ensuring Brian got a share. Though he remained focused on his priorities, Brian couldn't help but feel a small sense of validation from the camaraderie and recognition. Tim's growing friendship with Scooter naturally led to more time spent between their parents, Brian and Gertrude. Their interactions developed into an easy camaraderie, with Gertrude's humor and intelligence standing out to Brian. One afternoon, while the kids played, Brian decided to broach a subject that had been on his mind. He asked Gertrude if she'd noticed the other moms being unusually friendly lately. Gertrude's playful wit surfaced as she jokingly misinterpreted his question, deflecting with humor before explaining. She pointed out that the women showing him extra attention were single mothers. Brian was, in their eyes, an ideal prospect, a good father, an attractive man, and financially stable. However, she clarified that his marital status likely kept them from making direct moves, at least for now. The conversation took a serious turn when Gertrude revealed a piece of gossip. Many of the mothers knew about Brenda's affair. Even more troubling was the rumor that Brenda had cut Brian off from intimacy entirely. According to Gertrude, it was common knowledge among the group that Brian's marriage was on the rocks, and the single mom saw him as a soon-to-be free agent. Brian was shocked. The idea that his private struggles were so publicly known angered him. It didn't take long for him to figure out the source. Brenda must have shared details with her lover, who likely boasted to someone else. He vented his frustration to Gertrude, admitting he'd caught Brenda and her lover Grant in the act. Despite the betrayal, Brian had decided to stay married for Tim's sake, moving into his garage apartment to avoid unnecessary conflict. Brian further explained his arrangement. Living apart but under the same roof allowed him to be a constant presence in Tim's life. He told Gertrude about Brenda's reaction when Grant insisted she avoid intimacy with Brian or risk their affair being exposed. Brian, however, had no intention of engaging with Brenda, citing concerns for his health and self-respect. A recent STD test had come back clean, and he intended to keep it that way. Gertrude was furious on Brian's behalf, expressing her disbelief at how he'd been treated. She assured him that many of the mothers admired him not just for his looks, but for his dedication to his son and his good-natured personality. Brian downplayed her compliments, but Gertrude insisted, adding a self-deprecating joke about her own perceived shortcomings. Brian appreciated her honesty and thanked her for being upfront about the rumors. Still, he admitted feeling humiliated knowing others viewed him as a loser. Gertrude countered, praising his strength for enduring the situation to prioritize his relationship with Tim. She warned him, however, that Tim had started noticing the strain at home. It was only a matter of time before the boy pieced together the truth. As they continued talking, Gertrude confided her own worries. Scooter had developed a crush on Heather Grant, Grant's daughter. While Heather was a kind girl unaware of her father's behavior, the situation added an awkward layer for both her and Scooter. Brian, relieved that Tim wasn't entangled with Heather, joked about being grateful for small favors. Instead, Gertrude mentioned, Tim seemed interested in Holly Ingram, a girl who attended every game and cheered for him enthusiastically. Brian acknowledged Holly's presence, remembering her family fondly from his own school days. It was a bittersweet moment, highlighting both the challenges of his current reality and the silver linings that kept him focused on what truly mattered, Tim's happiness and future. Here's a rewritten version of the text, preserving the original word count and essence while fully rephrasing it. A couple of evenings later, Tim's team competed in the opening round of the district playoffs. As the game approached, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he was more anxious than Tim. Adding to his unease, the usual trio of single moms seemed particularly intent on drawing his attention. Norma Wilson had opted for a top that left little to the imagination, exposing a generous amount of her cleavage. She seemed to find countless reasons to bend over in front of Brian, whether to retrieve something or pretend to search for an item. Brian couldn't deny that her display was striking. Brandy Dorn took a different approach, wearing a form-fitting sweater that accentuated her toned waist and flat stomach, while subtly highlighting her firm curves. She peppered Brian with questions about the team and its players, keeping him engaged. Jillian Patterson, on the other hand, was much less discreet. She stood so close to Brian that her ample chest frequently brushed against his arm or side. Nearby, Gertrude shot him a knowing smirk as she handed him a hot dog and soda before heading back to her seat near first base. Brian noticed that Oddly, all three women left his immediate area at the same time. He was puzzled until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, I thought I'd join my husband to watch my son play today." "I didn't realize I'd have to navigate through a crowd of admirers to find him," Brenda announced, her tone louder than necessary. "Care to explain, Brian?" "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim looked sharp during batting practice," Brian replied, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Nice try," Brenda snapped. "Why were those women circling you like vultures? Good thing you don't seem to have a silicone allergy." "If you're asking me to explain their behavior, I'm just as clueless as you are," Brian admitted. "Honestly, I'm surprised to see you here." "My son is playing a big game. Of course I'm here. It's important to him, so it's important to me. Not to mention, it's a chance to spend some time together cheering him on," Brenda reasoned, though her expression tightened when Brian brought up her obligations. For a fleeting moment, Brenda wondered if Brian was insinuating something. She quickly dismissed the thought. If he suspected anything, he'd have confronted her in a far more direct and heated manner. One thing she knew for certain was that Brian would never tolerate infidelity without making it unmistakably clear. Brenda and Brian found seats in the bleachers. As they settled in, Brenda noticed some of the other mothers shooting her unfriendly glances. This puzzled her. She had no prior interaction with any of them, having missed every game so far. What could she have done to upset them? Her gaze landed on Gertrude, who sat slightly apart from the group. While Gertrude typically faded into the background, today her neatly styled hair and toned legs, shown off by slightly too short shorts given the chilly weather, caught Brenda's eye. The game kicked off, drawing Brian's full attention. The first two batters struck out before Tim stepped into the batter's box. Brenda's nerves spiked when the pitcher's first throw whizzed past Tim's head. The second pitch was outside, but Tim connected solidly, sending the ball sailing over first base for a stand-up double. The next batter, Scooter, stepped up, exuding strength and confidence. Scooter narrowly avoided being hit by the first pitch, which zipped dangerously close to his head. Brenda heard Brian chuckle as the boy prepared for the next throw. "Trying to intimidate those two is a mistake," Brian remarked to the nearby spectators. "I hope the pitcher tries a fastball." As the pitcher wound up, the crowd held its breath. He delivered a blazing fastball, but Scooter met it with a loud crack of the bat. Gasps and cheers erupted as the ball soared over the center field fence. Tim crossed home plate and waited to exchange high fives with Scooter. Gertrude beamed with pride as her son rounded the bases. She glanced at Brian and saw tears glistening on his cheeks. His countless hours spent coaching Tim and Scooter had paid off, and his pride was palpable. She was deeply grateful for Brian's mentorship, which had played a vital role in shaping her son's growth into a fine young man. Later, Brenda drove to a pizza place where the team was celebrating their victory. Finding a parking spot far from the entrance, she hurried inside only to see Norma and Brandy hovering too close to Brian. Their ample figures frequently brushed against him as he sorted out drinks for the boys. Here's the rewritten version of the text, rephrased and paraphrased while preserving the original word count. Brenda wasn't surprised to see the two women scatter as she neared. Their retreat triggered memories of a conversation she'd had with her lover, Bill Grant, just 2 weeks earlier. "Don't you think it's about time we take things to your bed?" Bill had pressed, as Brenda slipped back into her clothes after one of their secret encounters. "The idea of being with you in your husband's bed drives me wild." "I told you we wouldn't do that again until Brian and I have been together," Brenda reminded him firmly. "It's too risky otherwise." "Wait, you're telling me you still haven't slept with your husband since we did it at your house?" Bill asked, his disbelief evident. "You said you'd hold out as long as you could, but I didn't expect him to stay celibate this long. Hasn't he even tried?" Brenda sighed. "He went on the night shift that same day, and now he sleeps in the room over the garage. Honestly, we haven't even hugged since." "That's insane," Bill shot back. "There's no way a guy his age wouldn't be interested in intimacy, especially with a wife as gorgeous as you." "Is he gay, or does he have someone on the side?" "He's definitely not gay," Brenda insisted. "Brian is as straight as they come, and he would never cheat on me. He's just tired all the time from work. We only see each other at dinner. And even then, just on weekdays. Weekends are for yard work." "No way. A man with a wife like you wouldn't voluntarily go without intimacy, no matter how exhausted he is," Bill declared. "If he's getting some action elsewhere, then it works out better for us. He has his fun, and I get what used to be his." "Brian would never betray me," Brenda said, her voice resolute. "He takes our marriage vows seriously. That's just not who he is." Bill raised an eyebrow. And what do you think this is, Brenda? Well, this is different, she explained, trying to justify herself. It's just temporary. He's been so preoccupied with work and Tim's baseball games that he's barely noticed me. I deserve to have a little fun, too. I work full-time, keep the house in order, and handle the meals. This isn't forever, Bill smirked. Fair enough. Let's enjoy it while it lasts. Now, tell me when I can have you in your bed. It's such a turn-on. Brenda pushed the memory away as she watched the women who had been hovering around Brian fade into the background. It was obvious they were interested in him, too interested, in fact. Seeing their retreat only deepened her resolve to protect her marriage from their advances. Spotting Gertrude sitting alone, Brenda quickly formulated a plan. She plastered on a friendly smile and sat next to a startled Gertrude. It's so nice to see you again. Horace has turned into a fantastic player, and he's such a polite young man. You must be so proud. I am, Gertrude admitted cautiously. Tim's been doing great, too. All the time Brian has spent working with them has really paid off. He's been an incredible mentor to Horace. Brian is too good sometimes, Brenda replied, seizing her chance. I'm sure you've noticed how those busty blondes are constantly throwing themselves at him. I was hoping you might be able to help me out. Gertrude raised an eyebrow. And what exactly would that involve? Should I spray them with water when they get too close? Brenda chuckled awkwardly. Not quite. I can't make it to most games or practices because of work. And I know I can trust you to keep an eye on him. You're not his type. If you could stick close to him when I'm not around, it would mean a lot. And how exactly would that work? Gertrude asked skeptically. I'll tell Brian he should stay near you and act more engaged. Those women will think he's with you and hopefully back off. It might feel a bit awkward for you, but it's for a good cause. You'd be helping to protect my marriage. Gertrude stared at her in disbelief. So let me get this straight. You're worried these close-knessy single moms might seduce your husband, so you want me to pretend to be his stand-in wife when you're not around? Because you think I'm safe. What with being flat-chested and all? I didn't say you were plain, Brenda protested. I just know Brian. He wouldn't go for you over someone with cheerleader vibes. You'd be doing me a huge favor. Gertrude's tone turned serious. You really think cheating is the ultimate deal breaker? Absolutely, Brenda said firmly. It's a violation of trust. If Brian ever cheated, our marriage would be over. You were married. You must understand that. I do, Gertrude agreed. Fidelity is key to a healthy relationship. Satisfied, Brenda asked. So, can I count on you to help me out? Gertrude smiled faintly. Sure. Just make sure Brian knows what's going on. I'll do my part. After all, who better to ward off temptation than a boring, flat-chested single mom? That's not how I'd put it, but you get the idea, Brenda said, heading off to join her husband. The next day, Brian spoke up at practice. Brenda had a chat with me last night. She's convinced there are too many flirty moms hanging around and thinks I should stick close to you, Gertrude, or, as she calls you, safe. Why doesn't that make me feel safer? Smart man, Gertrude quipped. You're never safe around a single woman, no matter how plain she looks. You're one of the most beautiful women I know, Brian replied sincerely. It's not about looks or silicone. It's about the whole person. Gertrude blushed. Great. Now you've made my job even harder. Brian grinned. You'll see. I've got perfect vision. It's my judgment of character that might need a second look. And I think your wife may have misjudged us, Gertrude added, smiling softly. Here's the rewritten and paraphrased version of the text, maintaining the original word count and core essence while completely rephrasing it. Brian couldn't help but chuckle at the reactions of the single mothers when Gertrude, or Minx, as he'd started calling her, stayed by his side during practice. They exchanged playful banter and jokes, and the disappointment among the other women was almost tangible. In less than one practice, Minx had effectively separated him from the crowd of admirers. The next game required a 3-hour trip to Middleburg, so the team planned to travel the day before and stay overnight at a hotel. The goal was to ensure the boys were well rested for the big day. Brian offered to drive Jake Winston's parents along with Minx, and the conversation on the way revolved around the team's chances of making it through districts and possibly to the state championship. They arrived shortly after the team bus pulled into the hotel. As Brian helped Ralph Winston unload his luggage, he noted that the Winstons, like a few other parents, were staying at the same hotel as the team to assist as chaperones. The other parents had booked rooms elsewhere since the town was packed with players and fans attending multiple games. 6 teams were competing, making hotel space scarce. Before Tim boarded the bus earlier, Brian had reminded his son that he'd be staying at a different hotel. He also made it clear Tim needed to behave and follow the chaperone's rules. "I'll see you at practice in the morning," Brian reassured him. As the Winstons wheeled their bags into the team's hotel, Brian turned to Gertrude. "So, where are you staying, Minx?" "Same place as you," she said simply. Brian frowned. "I didn't tell you which hotel I booked. How'd you figure it out?" "I didn't," she replied with a sly smile. "Then how do you know we're at the same place? It's a busy weekend. What if you can't find a room?" Brian asked, clearly puzzled. "Oh, I'm sure I'll manage," she answered with a grin that left him even more confused. When they reached Brian's hotel a few minutes later, he suggested, "Why don't you check if there's a room available while I get checked in? I can wait and make sure you find something." "Thanks, but I'm fine waiting here," she replied confidently. As Brian finished checking in and collected his room keys, a realization began to dawn on him. Returning to the truck, he handed Minx one of the access cards. "Want to share the room? It's 207. "How thoughtful of you," she exclaimed, taking the key with a grin and planting a kiss on his cheek. "Let's head up. It's going to be a long night." When Brian woke up the next morning, he felt more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. Breaking his marriage vows had been a moral battle at first, but Minx had guided him through the guilt with her logical approach. "Let's be honest, Brian," she had said. "Brenda hasn't just cheated on you. She's completely cut you off. Even if she hadn't, she's risking your health by having unprotected love with a reckless man. She's made intimacy with her unsafe and undesirable. By her actions, she's effectively released you from your vows." Minx had continued, "I haven't been with anyone in over 2 years, and I've had a clean bill of health from regular checkups. You're clean too. Didn't you get tested after you found out about Brenda's affair? Plus, I've been on the pill for over a month in case we got the chance to be together." Then her tone softened. "Can you give me one good reason we shouldn't be together? Is it because you don't find me attractive? Your wife thought I was the safest choice to fend off those other women because she assumed you'd never be interested in me." "Minx, don't ever think that," Brian had reassured her. "You're incredibly desirable. I've never cheated on Brenda before, so this is an adjustment, but I'm ready." Her response surprised him. "There's something you should know first. Both my parents are in hospice and won't be around much longer. My brother has been sending game footage of Horace to a baseball coach at a top prep school in LA. If he gets a scholarship, we'll likely move back next year." She added, "I like you a lot, Brian, but this isn't something that can last. You're a married man with a cheating wife, and I'm just a single mom trying to do what's best for my son." Brian nodded, trying to focus on the bright side. "That's incredible news for Scooter. He's a talented player, and this is a great opportunity for him to compete at a higher level and get a good education. It's ironic, isn't it?" Minx said. "Your mentorship helped him improve so much that we're now considering leaving town. In a way, you've made this possible." Brian hesitated. "I don't think I'm cut out for a one-night stand. It might be better to skip this altogether than have one night and then go back to being celibate." "You're overthinking it," she teased. "We're talking about 6 months before anything changes. That's plenty of time for a lot of fun. Unless, of course, you're too old to handle it." Brian smirked. "We'll see about that. Will you live up to your nickname, Minx?" "For you? Absolutely," she quipped. "Whenever you need me, just whistle." "I've been told my whistling is pretty good," Brian joked. "Then you're definitely doing it wrong," she shot back with a wink. The baseball team secured the state championship, and Scooter received a scholarship to an esteemed prep school in California. Around Thanksgiving, Gertrude faced the loss of both her parents, who passed away within days of each other. Brian and Tim attended the funerals, where Brian met Gertrude's brother, Dexter. Dexter, though formally addressed by his family, preferred the nickname Grim and seemed to share an immediate camaraderie with Brian. Thanksgiving brought Brian to Brenda's parents' home, a long-standing tradition. That night, he found himself sharing a room with Brenda, as they always stayed over. Brenda initiated intimacy for the first time in months, suggesting they rekindle their physical relationship. Brian's response, laced with sarcasm, led to tension instead. While it achieved his goal of avoiding any intimacy with her, it also highlighted the cracks in their marriage. Brenda, unsettled by his tone, lay awake, questioning whether Brian suspected her affair or was simply frustrated by their lack of connection. The situation prompted her to reconsider the risky dynamics of her arrangement with Bill, especially as it pertained to her marital bed. Meanwhile, Brian had established a routine with his new night shift schedule. His mornings began with breakfast before heading to bed. Often he would wake around mid-afternoon to find Gertrude, whom he fondly called Minx, joining him. They would spend an hour together before she returned home to be there when Scooter finished school. This arrangement gave Brian time to prepare for Tim's return and allowed him to rest before starting work again. With baseball season over, the schedule worked seamlessly for both. In early December, Brian's work night was interrupted by a call from Tim. He learned that Tim, Scooter, and their friends, Heather and Holly, were stranded on D Street with a flat tire and no spare. Heather's car, a Corolla, had broken down near a sketchy arcade, leaving the group feeling uneasy. Brian, alarmed by their location, promised to resolve the issue. At work, Brian approached Gus, a colleague who also owned a Corolla. Gus offered to lend a mounted spare tire and suggested they use his car to get there quickly. Brian enlisted Jack, Holly's uncle, to join them, knowing he'd want to ensure Holly's safety. The three men set off, concerned about the group of teenagers in such a questionable area at night. At the same time, Brenda was enjoying the aftermath of her time with Bill when his phone rang. The call was from Heather, but Bill dismissed the situation as unimportant, advising her to call roadside assistance instead. Brenda overheard enough to sense unease, but chose not to press him for details. When Brian, Gus, and Jack arrived on D Street, a group of young men was loitering near Heather's car. Brian quickly retrieved the jack and tools while Gus carried the spare tire. Jack checked on the teenagers, instructing them to stay inside the car while they worked. The presence of the men brought an additional layer of tension, but the adults remained focused on the task. As Brian began loosening the lug nuts, the leader of the group approached Jack. He asserted a claim over the area, warning that they needed his permission to proceed. The situation was tense, but Brian, Gus, and Jack were determined to ensure the safety of the teenagers and resolve the problem efficiently. Before Jack had the chance to reply, Brian swung the tire iron and slammed it into the man's shins. The guy collapsed to his knees, groaning and clutching his legs while unleashing a string of expletives. Without hesitation, Brian grabbed the man by the collar, dragged him face down next to the flat tire, and pinned him to the ground by sitting on his back. Calmly, he resumed loosening the lug nuts. Two gang members rushed in to help their fallen leader, but Jack intercepted the first one with a sharp blow to the side of his head, dropping him instantly. As Gus stepped up, the second attacker quickly retreated, keeping a safe distance. "Jack, raise the car so I can swap out this tire," Brian said with a steady voice. Jack cranked the jack higher, while the gang shouted insults and threats. Occasionally, the pinned man tried to wriggle free, but Brian would yank his greasy hair, lift his head slightly, and push it back down with force. After two such reminders, the man decided to stay still. Brian removed the flat tire and slid on the replacement that Gus handed him. After securing the lug nuts by hand, Jack lowered the car. The gang members kept taunting, but the three men ignored them. As Brian tightened the nuts, he accidentally stepped on the leader's groin while walking over him. "Are you idiots talking to us?" Brian asked, tossing the tire iron between his hands as he advanced toward the gang. The group scattered immediately, unwilling to face him. "You kids better scram!" Jack shouted as Brian herded the gang further from the car. "And watch out for those fools lying in the street on your way out. Stay out of this neighborhood." The three men got back into Gus's car and followed Heather as she led them out of the area toward the kids' homes. Gus chuckled as they drove. "I can't believe you cracked that guy in the shins. He went down like a sack of bricks." "Thanks for letting me come along," Jack added with a laugh. "My hand's sore, but it felt great taking that guy down." "And then you sat on him while changing the tire," Gus howled. "That was gold." They were still laughing and swapping stories when they returned to work. By the next morning, the tale had spread through the plant, becoming a favorite among the night shift workers. It was exactly the kind of excitement that made the long hours pass more quickly. Later that afternoon, Brian was waking up when Minx jumped into bed with him. Without clothes and eager, she kissed him passionately. "Horace told me what happened last night. You were amazing. Thanks for looking out for the kids," she said, her gratitude evident. "Now you're going to be rewarded. I would have come over sooner, but I had to wait until Horace and Tim left to visit the girls since they're off school today." At work, Brenda was only an hour into her shift when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, clearly wanting to talk. "I heard Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson put some punks in their place last night when they messed with a group of kids on D Street. Sounds like a tire iron to the shins does the trick." Brenda quickly pieced it together. Heather must have called her father for help, only to be brushed off. The kids Sue mentioned had to include Holly, along with Horace and Tim. As Sue recounted the events, Brenda's anger toward Bill Grant simmered beneath the surface. Heather had needed her father, and he'd dismissed her. Brian and the others had stepped in to protect the kids, doing what any real man should. That afternoon, Brenda found Bill alone in the break room and confronted him. Heather called you for help and you ignored her. Those kids could have been in serious trouble and you told her to call AAA. What kind of father does that? It all worked out, Bill replied with a smug grin. Your husband and his pals played heroes. So, what's the big deal? The big deal is Brian acted like a real man while you turned your back on your daughter. My son was in that car. Bill smirked. If your idiot husband's so great, why am I the one screwing you while he hasn't been laid in months? All his heroics won't make his Johnson bigger than mine. You pathetic excuse for a man! Being a man has nothing to do with what's in your pants, Brenda snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. Brian is 10 times the man you'll ever be. Bill smirked, leaning back with his drink in hand. You say that, but last night, you didn't seem to mind choking down every drop. Let's face it, when it counts, I've got your little wimp beat in all the ways that matter. Brenda's face hardened with resolve. I'm done with you, she said firmly. Don't talk to me again. I want you out of my life completely. Bill shrugged, unfazed. Suit yourself. There's plenty of married women out there who know what they want. And they love a guy like me. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. Just make sure to ask nicely when you come crawling back. Brenda burst into tears and fled the room. She had betrayed her husband, disrespected their marriage, and jeopardized her family for an arrogant, self-absorbed manipulator. The weight of her choices crushed her, and she silently prayed Brian would never find out how deeply she had failed him. With that realization, she knew she had a lot of work to do to make amends. Minx was just finishing up with Brian, her breath still heavy from the moment, when a sound made her turn. Startled, she saw Brenda standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. How could you do this to me? Brenda sobbed, her voice trembling. I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me? Calmly, Minx reached for her clothes, sliding them on as she pressed a finger to Brian's lips, signaling him to stay quiet. I'm doing exactly what you wanted, she replied coolly. You asked me to keep those blonde bimbos away from Brian, and I used the only method that worked. My body. I never asked you to sleep with him, and you know it, Brenda shot back, her tears turning into anger. And Brian, how could you cheat on me with this scrawny tramp? Minx raised an eyebrow, unfazed. I get that walking in on this might sting, but let's keep the insults to a minimum. Your husband was desperate for relief, and I simply stepped in to help. Someone had to. Especially since Bill Grant made sure you were too busy to fulfill your wifely duties. Brenda's face turned pale. You know about Bill? She whispered. Who doesn't? Minx replied nonchalantly. Your affair with him has been the worst-kept secret in town. He promised you'd never have to sleep with Brian again, didn't he? Convenient for him. Meanwhile, I've been picking up the pieces and keeping Brian sane. Tears returned to Brenda's eyes. If Brian knew, why didn't he say anything? Why let it go on this long? Minx shrugged. You're a smart woman. What do most men do when they find out their wife's been cheating? Brenda's voice faltered as she answered. They get angry. Probably divorce me. Exactly, Minx agreed. And what happens after that? Would Brian stay here while you moved in with Bill? Would Tim go with you? No, Brenda snapped. I'd never leave my house, and Tim would stay with me. Brian would be the one forced to leave and pay support. Minx nodded. And that's exactly why Brian didn't confront you. Staying close to Tim was more important to him than exposing your affair. So instead of a dramatic breakup, he silently divorced you emotionally. You've been living like a separated couple for months. You were just too busy with Bill to notice. Brenda's voice softened. I told Bill we're done. I ended it after he refused to help his daughter last night. I couldn't stay with someone like that. So you didn't really choose to end it, Minx remarked dryly. He left you no choice. Even cheaters have their limits, I guess. Are you and Brian planning to be together now? Brenda asked, wiping her face. Minx smiled faintly. We're comfortable with how things are for now. Besides, Horace and I will be moving back to LA before the school year starts. When I go, I might help Brian find someone new if he lets me. Unlike Bill, I'm not here to wreck a family. You don't have any right to sleep with my husband, Brenda said firmly. He's mine. Minx's expression hardened. You forfeited that right the moment you crawled into bed with Bill Grant. That freed Brian of any obligation to you. And trust me, we have rules. Brian isn't allowed to touch anyone else, including you. Not while we're together. Brenda's eyes widened. You think I'd give him a disease? Who knows what Bill's been up to? You didn't exactly demand a clean bill of health before sleeping with him, did you? Minx countered. Brenda's tears returned as the reality of her choices sank in. So what happens now? Minx leaned back casually. We keep things as they are. You keep avoiding Brian and working late. I'll make sure he's taken care of. It works, doesn't it? No, Brenda said firmly. I'm not giving up. You'll leave soon and I'll remind Brian what a good wife I can be. Minx laughed. Go ahead. You can cook, clean, and play house all you want. Meanwhile, I'll handle the intimacy. Let's see who wins. Brenda looked at Brian. I'm so ashamed of how I treated you. Can you ever forgive me? Minx cut in. Forgiveness? Maybe. But trust, that's another story. You threw it all away for Bill. You better hope Brian is feeling generous when Tim graduates, or you might find yourself packing your bags. Why are you letting her speak for you? Brenda demanded, glaring at Brian. Minx answered for him. Because I'm not just his lover, I'm his friend. While you were off whispering lies to Bill, Brian and I were having honest conversations. And now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like some time alone with him. Months turned into years as Brian, Brenda, and Gertrude navigated the complexities of their intertwined lives. Tim graduated high school with honors, his passion for baseball evident in every game he played. Brian remained a steadfast figure in his son's life, mentoring Tim and his friend Scooter, whose move to Los Angeles for a prestigious baseball scholarship marked the culmination of Brian's coaching efforts. Brenda, now fully aware of the depth of her betrayal, worked tirelessly to rebuild the fractured relationship with Brian. She began attending therapy to address her decisions and insecurities, seeking a way to reconnect with the man she had once loved. Despite her efforts, Brian remained emotionally detached, his trust too deeply eroded to allow for reconciliation. Brenda turned her energy toward becoming a better mother. She supported Tim through his college applications and attended his games with a fervor she hadn't shown before. Though Brian acknowledged her attempts, he kept his emotional walls firmly in place. Brenda eventually found solace in her relationship with Tim, realizing that her role as a mother was one she could still honor. Brian flourished in his role as foreman, earning respect from his peers and building a new life centered on self-improvement. His garage apartment became a symbol of his independence, a sanctuary where he could reflect and heal. He continued his workouts, developed new hobbies, and even started taking online business courses to explore entrepreneurial aspirations. Gertrude, true to her promise, eventually left for Los Angeles with Scooter. The goodbye was bittersweet. Their relationship had been a lifeline for Brian during his darkest times. They parted on good terms, with Gertrude encouraging Brian to open his heart again when the time was right. With Tim off to college, Brian sold the family home, a house that had become a monument to both his labor and his pain. He moved to a smaller, modern home closer to his workplace, a space that represented his new beginning. Brenda, who had stayed in the family home after their divorce, received a portion of the sale but chose to remain in the area to stay close to Tim. Brian began dating cautiously, meeting women who appreciated his integrity and humor. Though scars from his marriage lingered, he found that his experiences had made him more empathetic and discerning. Tim thrived in college, earning a baseball scholarship and excelling both on and off the field. Brian and Brenda found common ground in their pride for their son, often attending his games together. While their relationship remained cordial and distant, their shared love for Tim brought moments of connection and mutual respect.